Just before we begin, I mentioned that this event is hosted by Transition Together. And for those of you who are new to it, Transition is a movement of ordinary people who are responding locally and together to some of the big challenges of our time. And they're doing it by imagining what a positive future could be in their community and then coming together to take practical action to build it. And there are transition communities in around 50 countries around the world, and Transition Together is a project supporting almost 300 local groups in the United Kingdom. So it's come a long way since Rob Hopkins and a group of people came together in Totnes in Devon around 18 or 19 years ago and started talking about the first transition town. But what has Rob Hopkins been up to recently? In the past couple of years, you might have seen him dressed as a spaceman, perhaps at the Boomtown Festival, or indeed in front of the Houses of Parliament at the big one, 2023 London climate protest. You might have heard him ushering guests onto his time machine and transporting them to a transformed future just a few years from now on his From What If to What Next podcast. If you follow his work on Patreon, you might have seen some early versions of music videos recorded in 2030. Tonight, Rob is going to spill the beans about what on earth is going on and tell us more about how he has spent the last couple of years researching and writing his new book, How to Fall in Love with the Future, a time traveler's guide to changing the world. And we really are privileged that this is the first time he has given a sneak peek into the book's content and indeed a look behind the scenes of writing it. It's due to be out in May, I think, Rob, but we'll hear a wee bit more about that. So for tonight's event, Rob and I are going to start the conversation, and after about 30 minutes or so, we'll have time to hear questions from you. So please do be thinking what you would like to ask Rob, put them in the chat as we go along for when we open the floor. But to start us off, Rob, why don't you tell us a bit more about the journey that you've been on in the past few years to write this book?
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everybody. How lovely to see such a gorgeous collection of new friends and old friends and colleagues, some very far away and some I'm seeing very literally just around the corner from my house. It's so very lovely to see you all. Thank you. Yeah, and this is kind of quite exciting because when you lock yourself away for a year and a bit and you write something, I with the last book, From What Is to What If, I always wondered if that was going to be the book where you would all say, well, do you know what? I was with him up to that point, but I think he's really lost it now. I've no idea what he's going on about. And so I slightly have the same concern with this book that you might all think, well, yeah, what is he? Where is he gone now? So this book, I guess, came about after the last one, and I was doing a lot of work around imagination. I'd started doing the podcast. I set myself a rule with that podcast to never do a single episode with two white male guests in, which was one of the best things I ever did. And it pushed me in lots of different, really interesting directions and conversations that maybe otherwise I wouldn't have had. And around 2021 or something, I saw a T-shirt a young woman wore at a Black Lives Matter protest in Washington, and it said, "I've been to the future, we won." And when I saw it, it gave me goosebumps, and it was just before the big one happened outside Westminster that Chris just mentioned. And they'd asked me to go up and give a talk, and I was going to do my usual. So what we need to do is, and here's what's happening in the transition movement talk. And then I thought, no, actually, I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to do it as if I'm a time traveler who's just come back from 2030, and I've been to the 2030 in which we won, and I'm going to tell you about it. And I went to the hardware shop and I bought a cheap hazmat suit, and I bought a kind of a space helmet online, and I went up to London, and I did this talk as a time traveler who had just come back, a bit like a lecture at the Royal Geographical Society in 1830 from someone who just come back from the Galapagos Islands or something. And there was a moment, and I talked about, the bicycle rush hours were incredible, and the this and the that, and the rooftop farms of 2030 were just amazing. And there was a moment in that, because I only had 10 minutes, about 8 minutes in, I said something like, and when I when I just the fact that I'm here telling you about what I saw there, just telling you about this and what I saw there makes me really feel really, really emotional. And I looked round the crowd of people and there were tears on people's faces. And I thought, this is interesting. What's happening here? Something really interesting is happening here, which wasn't something that I'd normally seen. And that was what kind of set me off on this journey of exploring what in the book I call temporal fluidity, which is this idea of playing around with time. That as activists, all too often our experience is we have a threat or a challenge in the present. And so all of our activism is in the present. You know, we've all been on marches. What do we want? When do we want it now? No one ever says, what do we want? When do we want it? In about 250 years or 37 years ago or something like that, you know. And so as we go on, I'll explain a bit more about that sense of finding activists who are also time travelers. So the book is in two halves. One is called Why Build a Time Machine, and one is called How to Build a Time Machine. And the How to Build a Time Machine bit is really just I always operate with the logic that I might got knocked over by a bus tomorrow, and there's no point hoarding tools and activities. They need to be shared. So that's what the second bit is. But I guess the first bit, it starts out with a reflection on where we are and the polycrisis that we're in. And I interviewed Peter Kalmus, who's a climate scientist who some of you might have seen has been on the TV quite a lot recently with the fires in Los Angeles, about, well, what's the best case scenario? We talk about the worst case scenario all the time, but what could happen if we did absolutely everything we could possibly do? And what happens when we shut that possibility down and stop talking about it and just talk about collapse and extinction all the time? And I came across a quote by a woman called Wendy Brown, who's a political theorist, which I'd love. She said, "Only a compelling vision of a less frightening and insecure future will recruit anyone to a progressive and revolutionary alternative future or rouse apolitical citizens for the project of making that future. This vision must be seductive and exciting, and it must be embodied in seductive and exciting leadership." And and so I began to, partly through the podcast and the people who I was getting on there, but I started to find lots of activists, particularly in the US, particularly women of color in the US, talking about time travel as a tool for activism in a way that I just found absolutely fascinating. And uh, in the workshops that I do and in the talks that I do, I always do an activity, and some of you have probably done it with me, where I bring my time machine along and we turn that room into a time machine. And I take people from the present into 2030. And I always say there are many, many different quantum threads that head from the present into the future. And some of them are absolutely horrible. Believe me, I've been there, I've seen them. We don't want to go there. Trust me on that. But there are some just on the outer edges of possibility, the ones that resulted from us doing absolutely everything we could have possibly done, that are exhilarating and extraordinary, and you need to know about them. And I've done that exercise now with thousands of people, sometimes with 10 people in a workshop, sometimes with 1,500 people in a hall. And what's fascinating to me is that the results that happen, when you ask people to feedback what they saw when you do that, are always the same. The air is cleaner, the bird song is louder, people feel happier, more complete. They feel like they're part of something. They can see the world changing around them, and so on and so on. I read a book by a woman called Elise Boulding, who some of you may know, who was a peace activist in about 25 years ago. And she was doing pretty much the same activity with people then. She was working in prisons in the US, doing that kind of time travel work there. And the things that she reported people saying were almost exactly the same as people are saying now. And her speculation was, I think if you did this at any point during history, people would say the same thing. And when she reflected on that, she said, we have many more potential co-workers in the task of building a more peaceful world than we ever knew. And I did a lot of research around the neuroscience of what happens. This is the last bit of answering this question, Chris, and then we can move on. But I was really interested, like, what happens when I was doing that talk at the big one, surrounded by all those people with the tears on people's faces? what was going on inside them. And so neuroscientists have done a lot of research around what they call mental time travel. So when you're trying to imagine the future, you're basically looking through the kind of the cupboards of your memory and finding different things and assembling them to make the new bit, which is your imagination, which is why if you just watch Fox News all day, it's very hard to imagine a low carbon future because there's nothing in those cupboards for you to work with at all. But what happens when you help people to imagine the future in a way that is as multi-sensory as possible, and people visualize it, and maybe they can smell it, and maybe they can taste it, and they discuss it with other people, and they attach emotions to that, then what happens is that you help people to create memories of the future. So the next time you're trying to imagine the future and you go to those cupboards to look through them, there's this bright, sparkly thing that you put in there 4 months ago when you came on a workshop or when you went to a talk or whatever it was. So that building of memories of the future, I think, is so important. And the more we can make that playful and theatrical and multisensory, and I'll talk a bit more later about the multisensory part of it, um, then the more powerful and effective that can be. So I've spent the last year and a bit locked away in my house and going and talking to lots of really interesting people, and yeah, and it'll be coming out in May, as you said, Chris.
And Rob, you've written a number of books before, but this is accompanied by a music project as well, which you're calling Field Recordings from the Future. Can you tell us a wee bit more about that and why you're doing them in partnership, how they kind of relate to each other?
Yeah, so at the beginning of COVID, like all of us, I was working from home, and I like listening to music when I work, but then I found that music that had beats or had lyrics with it, I couldn't really concentrate. And I got really into this whole genre of kind of ambient electronic music, which is a whole beautiful world of music. And some of those people that I was discovering were using field recordings in really interesting ways. And there was one guy in particular who had this piece of music which used field recordings that just, for me, really evoked a feeling of a future full of community and people together and excitement and kind of awe, just from the way the music and the field recordings came together. And I started thinking, well, what if you made music like that, but the field recordings came from the future? If you had recordings from the future that could result from us doing everything we could possibly have done, and you made music out of that, what would it be like? And so I thought, well, why not? Nothing ventured, nothing gained. I'm going to try and track down the guy who made that record and see if he might possibly be up for doing something collaborative. But he's probably like impossibly cool, and he lives in LA or Berlin or something like that. And I looked him up, and he lived in Totnes. And I got in touch with him, and it turned out he knew one of my kids. And I said, can we go and have a coffee? And we went for coffee, and I said, look, I've got this idea. And he said, I love it, brilliant, let's do it. And so I must also at this point thank everybody who's on this call who has supported the podcast that I did through Patreon, because actually it was the funds that were raised through the podcast and Patreon, which was what allowed me to support Kit in making this music. So thank you for that. And we've now made 8 tracks, and I went to visit different places like the car-free neighborhoods in the Vauban in Freiburg, landscapes being rewilded by beavers in Cornwall, underground mushroom farm in Brussels, the bicycle rush hour in Utrecht, um, all sorts of things like that. And I would sit there and make recordings, and then I would get in touch with Kit and say, okay, I'm imagining kind of like this and kind of like that. And we had a lovely relationship where I could talk to him and say, this track is kind of yellow, and he would know what I meant. And so we've now made 8 of these pieces of music, which will be coming out at the same time as the book, as a vinyl release, which is possibly the most exciting thing of my entire life. Made the 15-year-old me deliriously happy and excited, and as a digital thing as well. And what we're doing for that is, as well, we're working with a guy called Tim Dollymore who lives near Totnes, who is like extraordinary at doing really big immersive light projections, and we're developing now a field recordings from the future time portal, which can open up somewhere as a space that you're in, and all the videos that were made for each track are kind of projected all around you as an immersive thing. So in my wildest dreams, what happens is that field recordings from the future becomes like almost like one of those, those Van Gogh immersive things that they project that goes all around the world in different cities, and it becomes something that is a really that everybody wants to see and experience. Going back to what Wendy Brown said, how do we make this stuff seductive and exciting? And if we can make these kind of immersive, really believable spaces with music and light, then that feels really, really exhilarating to me. So look out for that. That'll be coming. That'll be coming along soon. And yeah, I've loved doing that and creating. And there's something really interesting actually when you go and sit by like when I went to the when you go and visit those places and you're listening to them through the ears of imagining them as being 2030, and that this is now the new normal everywhere, and you're just listening to it and recording it, you hear all sorts of things that you normally don't hear. When I went to Utrecht to see the bicycle rush hour, you'd a city where 33,000 people cycle into the center of Utrecht every morning. It's the most, if you want to experience what the future is going to be like, just go by the train station in Utrecht at 8 o'clock on a weekday morning. It's just extraordinary. But when you're actually sitting there recording them, it's not just like uniform passing of bikes. Every one of those bikes has a different story. And you see some of them are kids cycling into school together, chatting with each other. Some of them are people with their headphones listening to music really loud and singing out really loudly like it's karaoke, and they don't mind if anyone hears because they'll be gone in a minute anyway. And when I went to the Vauban in Freiburg to record there, because there are no cars and it's all pedestrians and bicycles, and there's no internal combustion engine noise drowning everything out, you can hear things like, as you walk down the street, you can hear people having piano lessons in their house. So there's one of the tracks which is built around this recording I made where you could hear a piano lesson in someone's house, and then Kit built the melody from the piano in somebody's house. It's just gorgeous. So yeah, it's been a really, really lovely project, and it'll sit really nicely alongside the book. The original idea was that the book would have, in between the chapters, it would have passages about field recordings from the future with a QR code, and you could go backwards and forwards between the two. But the publishers didn't like that, so there'll be two separate things.
Well, it's nice to have two things, and it sounds really a lovely way to kind of embody the future and step into it in a more real way.
Yeah.
When we were talking before this event, Rob, you made the strange claim that Cat Women of the Moon might be one of the most important films ever made. Now, I've not seen that film. I believe you have watched it. Tell us where you're coming from.
Okay, well, it's also one of the truly worst films that anyone has ever made. So the reason that I talk about Cat Women of the Moon, which you can find on YouTube, but I don't recommend that you do, is that there's a whole chapter in the book about longing and why longing is such an important part of this. So uh, Ruha Benjamin, who is an activist in the US, wrote a book called Imagination, a Manifesto. She wrote, A world without prisons? Ridiculous. Schools that foster the genius of every child? Impossible. Work that doesn't grind us to the bone? Naive. A society where everyone has food, shelter, love? In your dreams. Exactly. And it feels to me like actually one of the main things that we need to get an awful lot better in movements around climate change and social justice and things is around the cultivation of longing. And the reason that I talk about that film is that there's a whole section in the book about the moon. So when Jules Verne in 1865 wrote a book called From the Earth to the Moon, he pulled together all the best science he could find about how we might actually get to the moon. Some of it was extraordinarily accurate. He said the rocket would be made from aluminium, it would take off, it would have 3 astronauts, it would take off from Florida, large crowds would come and see it. Some of it was not quite so accurate. So in his book, the rocket was fired out of a cannon, which we now know the moment you press the button would reduce the astronauts to something very similar to jam. And but that book inspired then scientists and artists to try and figure out how we might actually do it. So then the first film that was made in 1902, Georges Méliès, A Trip to the Moon, was about that. Then you had all sorts of things like, Tintin went to the moon, Mickey Mouse went to the moon, Popeye went to the moon. There were jazz dances about going to the moon. And Catwomen of the Moon was one of about 9 films made in the 1950s, all of which had a plot that was a variation on the idea of an all-male crew of astronauts fly to the moon, and when they arrive there, they find an entirely female population who haven't seen any men for a very long time. I don't quite how the genetics of how this would actually have sustained itself is sort of lost to the film. But this sort of it was all of these films where just basically going to the moon kind of we were building the longing to go to the moon. So it meant that in 1963, when JFK said, "We will go to the moon," not because it's easy, but because it's hard or whatever it was, actually, we'd already been there thousands and thousands of times. When Neil Armstrong actually set foot on the moon, Hergé, who wrote Tintin and wrote all the 2 books where Tintin goes to the moon, did a strip for the New York Times, which showed Neil Armstrong landing on the moon to be greeted by Tintin and Captain Haddock and Professor Calculus with a sign saying, "Welcome to the moon, Mr. Armstrong," because we'd already been there thousands and thousands and thousands of times. So the idea that we need to build that longing in a culture. So if we try and transpose that to the climate emergency, we don't have 100 years. But also, if we just talk about collapse and extinction all the time, it's just not going to cut it. And so for me, it's like, how do we cultivate longing for the world that we could still build, that sits on the outer edges of possibility, but is still there just about? And that leads also to the realization that actually often, who are the people in our culture who are brilliant at cultivating longing? Are they climate scientists? Not really. Are they climate activists? Maybe occasionally. Are they transition activists? Sometimes, actually. Are they artists, poets, street artists, storytellers, people who write stories for Netflix, people who are theatre directors? These are the people who we need. We can't do this without those people. So the bit that I always compare it to is in Alice in Wonderland, when she's really big and she's looking through the little door into the most beautiful garden she's ever seen, and she wants to be in that garden more than anything else. For me, the question is, how do we create activism that can have that same kind of effect on people, that it becomes irresistible, that it helps people to create a kind of a new North Star? And I do a lot of talks in France, and there are some friends here who I know through doing talks in Belgium and France. And that word longing is quite a particularly English word. When I use it in talks in France, then they use the word desire, and then they put loads of superlatives on the front. Very, very, very strong desire. But longing is a very particular word. There's a guy called Grant Faulkner who wrote an article about longing, where he said the kind of longing I'm thinking about is different than desire. Desire is an itch that wants to be scratched, but longing is the ache that accompanies a deep love that lies in your heart. How do we do that? How do we find ways to unlock that? That's the question that I'm really trying to bring to people in the book.
And that leads us nicely on, Rob, to ask you, what do you hope this book is going to catalyze in the world? What impact do you want it to have?
So the where it goes after that is as I started looking around, and I was taken by this idea of, okay, so I am a climate activist, I'm a transition activist. What if I'm a time traveler as well? What if that's part of my practice? What if that's what I'm bringing is I'm the builder of a time machine, and I put my time machine in service to the climate and ecological emergency? Then what does that mean for how I show up and how I present myself? And as I looked around, I started to find other people who were using time travel and temporal fluidity in their work in a way that I just thought was amazing. So there's a woman called Justine Boussard who who does things in London that she calls amateur ancestors, where she uses things that already exist. So she takes people to museums in London, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the British Museum, and uses those collections as a way of taking people on a journey through deep time. So she takes them out of the present and into the past, and then uses that to get them to think about the future in very different ways. There's the activity that Ruth Ben Tovim developed, which I know some of you have taken part in, which was originally called Transition Town Anywhere, and is now called Town Anywhere, which I facilitated with her in Bristol in August, which is the most extraordinary activity where, and I know it was done recently with Phil Frodshams on the call here, and it was done in New Mills recently as well. And it's an amazing activity for picking a group of people up in the present and depositing them down into the near future. And then they play in that future. They build it literally with cardboard and string and sticky tape. It's an amazing thing. And another story is about the new constellations, who some of you who came to the What Next Summit will remember that process that was run in Barrow in the northwest of England, which was a kind of which took a group of people from the town on a journey of identifying a new North Star for that community, using sound, using visuals, using all kinds of different ways to get people into that space. A guy, and then also as I've been going along, I get contacted by people who say, "Oh, I've built a time machine too." Well, there was one time somebody got in touch with me and he said, "Rob, I hear you've built a time machine. Could you share your plans with me?" And I wrote back and I said, "You you do actually realize you can't actually build a time machine?" And he wrote back, he said, "You may be right," which was my favorite reply that anybody sent me on that. But there's a guy called Andy Clay in North Devon who built a time machine in his town and invites people in it to travel to the future. There's an amazing woman who's on this call, actually, Anaïg Plassard, who made a film for French television called Return to Plabennec, where she dressed up as a time traveler and went around the town engaging people in transition through her role as a time traveler with an "I've been to the future, we won" sign written in French, which was just fantastic. And I started to find as well as people who were activists and practitioners using time travel as a tool, like the wonderful Black quantum futurism in the United States, who are one of the most inspiring pair of activists I've ever come across, who talk about quantum science, Black history, Black liberation, futurism in a way that is just completely played straight. It's not like some camp jokey thing. They're awesome. And I've interviewed for the book an artist in Canada called Camille Turner, who did a project called Afronautic Research Labs. And Afronautic Research Labs, uh, so everybody knows that there was a big slave trade in the United States, but Canada tells kind of a different story about itself. They were the nice guys where people could escape to and be well looked after. Wasn't quite like that. On the northeast coast of Newfoundland, there were 19 slave ships built, very active slave trade. And so she's done loads and loads of research into the slave trade in Newfoundland. And then she has different rooms where she sets out all this archive material that she's found, like adverts for rewards for slaves that have run away and slave auctions and things. And then people are invited to come in and look and read this material. That's very nice on its own, right? As a thing. The brilliant bit is that there are always two people of color, herself and somebody else, in ceremonial robes with these mad glasses with lights in the corner, who never speak and who just stand at the side, and their role is just to witness. And the story that they tell is that they have come back from the future to this moment now, because this moment of the world finally understanding the horror of the mid-Atlantic slave trade is such an important moment in human evolution that they have traveled back through time to come and witness this moment. So it's people playing, using the future to help understand the past, to look at the present in different ways. That's just absolutely fascinating to me. And yes, and I also found organizations that are using time travel. So in North Wales, the Bana Brechennog, apologies to any Welsh people here, national park, what was the Brecon Beacons National Park and has recently renamed itself. They wrote their management plan up to 2050 And it's an extraordinary document. Most of those documents are quite dry. Theirs was written as a vision document. It had poems from people during the transition. It had photos from the transition. It had postcards from the future. It was beautiful. And I went and did a talk at CAT, and there were two of the women who wrote that were there at the time. And as a result of that, they got back in touch with me a few months later and said, Rob, we've built a time machine. And it turns out that somewhere in their storeroom, they had a planetarium that they had bought that fitted about 40 people could fit inside this planetarium, and they've adapted it into a time machine, and they've made videos of the past and videos of the future, and they use it to present their plan not as a dry document but as a sort of an immersive trip through time and helping to gather people's kind of ideas about the future. There's also a whole bit in the book, and I'll stop it again in a minute, but you can see I get very excited by all of these things, and it's very nice to be able to discuss them with other people. Is that there's also a whole bit in there about time, and I love the fact that nobody has a very good definition of time, and the best one I could find was that time is nature's way of stopping everything from happening at once, which is just beautiful. And so there's a whole section in there about time and about how time is also our understandings of time, how they shape our culture, how they shape how capitalism depends on a very particular model and understanding of time. And there's a guy called Giordano Nani who wrote a book about time and colonization, who wrote, a functioning clock became more than an instrument of conquest, it was also a symbol of civilization. So often when one country would colonize another, one of the first things they would do would be to start putting clock towers up all over the place and getting everyone to work with time in that way. And so I talk as well in there about how different cultures have different understandings of time. We have this idea of very linear time that just ticks along like this. Actually, there are some cultures, some African cultures, where time goes the other way, where actually the direction is about going back in a very different way. So the way that we think about time, the way we understand time, very much shapes the kind of civilizations and cultures that we build. And maybe it's time to start becoming more flexible and fluid with how we understand time, and creating kind of timeless spaces, creating time spaces where time runs backwards, or playing around with it in that kind of a way. So my hope with the book, to come back to what your question was, my hope with the book is that it will is firstly that it might inspire. It feels to me like there's a before COVID, Fridays for a Future was flying, and it was having such an impact. The Swedish Aviation Authority reported a 9% fall in flights during Fridays for Future. They called it the Greta effect, because kids were going home and saying to their parents, let's not do that anymore, and decline in meat and all sorts of different things. Extinction Rebellion had an incredible effect, but it feels to me like maybe what I'm hoping this book might inspire is a coming together of people around a kind of a positive futurist movement, which is clearer about hold spaces for, well, what do we want? As I said, when I do that time machine exercise with people, actually most people that that I get that from, it's so similar, and maybe we start there and we work back. So I'm hoping that it might inspire that. I'm also hoping that it will inspire a real much better coming together of artists and the people who are better at cultivating longing than we are, and finding really new ways that none of us have imagined yet of actually getting it out. And as I said, what I'd love would be for field recordings from the future just to take off and to incorporate loads of other different recordings from the future, and that people take the ones that we've made and mix those up and sample those. And it's like that, just that we, we're in a time when Elon Musk and Donald Trump and these people are just colonizing the future so incredibly quickly. And there's such a lot of despair particularly among young people, but so many people about the future, because when they look at the future, that's all they can see is those people and what they're up to. And I feel like we so urgently need a movement which is about telling different stories about the future and what's still possible, and how we bring that alive for people.
Thanks, Rob. For those of you who aren't looking, the chat is really lively. There's lots of questions coming in there already. There's one question about the recording from tonight's event, so we will send that to you if you registered for today's event. We'll send you a link to the recording and also some of the key links that have been mentioned, but you can also save the chat and there's instructions there to do that if you'd like. I have a couple more questions for Rob, just while we're finishing off. Please do think of your questions and put them into the chat, and then we'll be having some time to kind of hear thoughts and respond to some of those questions in a short while. You talked there about time, Rob, and I'm thinking about how you were there at the beginning of the Transition Towns movement, and obviously that's coming up to nearly 20 years now, and look into the future as well. And I'm curious to ask about how you think transition has changed over the years and what its future holds, maybe ways it needs to keep changing, as we think about the past and the future of transition.
God, that makes me feel very, very old. Um, yeah, Transition Town Totnes is celebrating the 20th anniversary of Transition Town Totnes in June this year, which is I wasn't even in Totnes then, so it's a slightly early date. I mean, the first thing I would say here is I feel like, any answer I give to this is only as valid as what anybody else who's involved in transition on this call would have to say to that. I mean, for me, at the beginning, it was very much designed as a response around peak oil and climate change. And over time, the peak oil bit of it kind of fell away, and the climate change bit became more and more and more pressing and obvious and urgent. What I've always loved about transition is its willingness to be kind of shaken up and looked at afresh through in the first book we had the 12 steps of transition. This is what it is. And after 2 years, when we actually asked transition groups, so what are you actually doing, they'd say, well, we did step 3 and then step 10 and then some other random stuff altogether and then step 2. And it was like, okay, nobody was going 1, 2, 3, 4. So okay, so then the second book, the transition companion, looked at it more as being like a set of ingredients that you might use to bake a cake, and there are certain stages to baking a cake that you need to follow, but every place would make a cake using its own particular ingredients that were appropriate to itself. And then, there have been various iterations that have grown out of it since then. I think as well, since it's also become much more aware of the need to be much more inclusive in what it does and how it works with a wider diversity of people, and that but it keeps that. I always love one of the people I interviewed on the podcast, Mariam Kaba, who was a great, great hero of mine, a prison abolition activist in America. She said, we must imagine while we build, always both. And so for me, when I wrote From What Is to What If, it was really interesting as a kind of a new way of looking at what was happening in the transition movement, that it had that balance of creating those kind of imagining spaces, creating and holding those safe places where people could really imagine the future, but then it had that element of, right, so let's let's go and do it. I think now there are quite a few transition groups who've been going for a long time and who have quite a lot of things to show for it, whether it's gardens or projects or energy installations or whatever. And maybe one of the things of where it goes from here is that, if assuming that some of the ideas in this book actually resonate with people, is that we, in a sense, what we're doing by creating those projects is pulling the future through into the present. When I talk about the world of 2030, the world of 2040, it's not like it fell out of the sky, fully formed magically on December 31st, 2029. If you know where to look in 2025, it's all of that future is already there. That's what we're trying to do in the field recordings from the future project. So I would hope that there would be maybe a way where we can start to use what we've already created to give people tours and to present them more theatrically, as in, we are transition so and so, let us take you to 2030, and we go and visit these things and explain actually what has come from that and what it's led to. And maybe there's a role for involving actors in bringing that alive and making it more playful and kind of believable somehow. There's a lovely story that I tell in the book about there's I talk about Sun Ra quite a lot in the book, who was an amazing jazz musician in the 60s, 70s, 80s, who told a fantastic story about himself where he said, I'm not a human being, I'm an angel from Saturn. And everybody in his band, as far as they were concerned, he was an angel from Saturn. And it was all played completely straight. I read a book that described him as being an everyday utopian. And he died in 1993, but his band still lived together in a house in North Philadelphia, I think. And in their neighborhood, there's a movement which is trying to reforest the poorest parts of the city because they're seeing the temperature rising, and they call them tree deserts or something. You know, like in the poorest neighborhoods, there's just no trees, and those trees make the areas underneath them 8 degrees cooler. So they're trying to have a kind of an urban tree planting program there, and it's called Street Work. And they did this amazing event where they invited Sun Ra's orchestra, who still play, to come and play in the park. But they called it Summoning the Future Forest, not just like, hey, we're going to plant some trees. They called it Summoning the Future Forest. So the idea of that event was that was the event people would look back to, where the forest was summoned from the future and into the present. And one of the books I read about Sun Ra described him as, I can't remember the words now, but that it was like done very seriously. You know, so what would it be like if actually we had transition groups who could open time portals and give people the experience of stepping through into that future in a way that was kind of completely serious, and we could do that and inhabit that in a quite a theatrical kind of a way, and make it multi-sensory as well. You know, there's one of the exercises I do on the workshops that I do, which I call Making Sense of the Future, but sense as in SCENTS, where after we've imagined the future, I give everybody a little paper cup, and I say, okay, you've got 20 minutes. And in that cup, I want you to make a cocktail of smells that to you smell like the future that you've longed for. You can go outside, go to the garden, go to the wherever you go, to the forest, go to the kitchen, whatever. Make a cocktail of smells in that cup that smells like the future. And then they all come back, 40 people. I say, and you have to give it a name. All good cocktails have a name. And then I mark out on the floor a little area. And the idea is that you have to go around as if you were at a cocktail party, work the room. You've got to get around and smell as many of the different things, hear the name. And after about 15 minutes, you've smelt about 40 different smells of what the future could smell like. And something starts to get into your bones. You know, the poet Rilke once said, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. And that's what we need to be doing. Like the way, if we can use taste and smell and sound to help bring that future alive, then for me, something really thrilling and exciting starts to happen then.
Thank you, Rob. You've given us a lot to think about. Just before we open the floor, we're going to have a little sneak peek of one of your field recordings from the future. So I'm going to ask Rich to set that up. Please.
I'll just say nobody else has seen this before. We're going to just show you the first 3 or 4 minutes of one of the videos from field recordings from future. And this is filmed in a place in Cornwall called Woodland Valley Farm, which is one of the most extensive and mind-blowing beaver rewilding projects anywhere in the UK. And so this drops you immersively into a 2030 where beaver rewilding is just now rolled out across the country as a key part of accelerating flood protection, because we realize that beavers are much better hydrological engineers than human beings could ever possibly be. And this is the world that we created by developing that level of humility.
That's great. So just while this is playing, please do keep your questions coming and we'll hear some of them afterwards.
if you have a stream or a river without beavers, it's like a little garden bonfire of biodiversity. If you put beavers in, it's like throwing petrol onto the bonfire. There's nothing else like it in the temperate world for bringing life. So we've had them here now in Cornwall really since 2017. So we're 13 or 14 years into the process, if you like, and from a number of enclosures, we've now got beavers out into quite a number of the rivers and streams in Cornwall, and partly as a factor of our landscape, they're not really causing much conflict with farming, but they are bringing back an awful lot of water into our headwaters and keeping it there in times of flood and drought. They're entertaining our visitors to the county. They're hosting a huge amount of other wildlife. And I think in quite a few places they're actually beginning to provide serious natural flood management. One pair of beavers on 200 metres have done that. Now what if we had 10 pairs of beavers across the whole catchment now above Laddock? I don't think it would ever flood. I don't think it could. It would be very hard to see how it could anyway. The best thing is seeing people's faces when they first see one. Just a gift.
Very much, Rich.
Oh, you'll have to wait to see the rest of it.
It's just a little teaser. Thank you very much. Thanks for sharing that, Rob. A world exclusive, we can describe it as. And yeah, really lovely to just settle in and live in that future for a few minutes. We've had loads of questions in the chat, and there are so many people here tonight. I would really love to hear from as many of you as possible, or at least address as many of the questions as possible. I fear it won't be possible to do them all, but we'll do our best to take a mix and see how we can get. So I'm going to invite a couple of people to ask their questions, and then maybe I'll gather a few up. I really want to encourage you to be really brief so that we can hear from other people. And I'm also going to invite Rob to answer them briefly so that we can have the chance to go on and hear some other questions. So Lisa Robinson has asked an interesting question in the chat. Lisa, I don't know if you're here and would like to unmute and ask it about the stamina involved in creating this cultivating for longing. Lisa, are you with us?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, Lisa, go ahead.
Rob, when you speak about longing and even about sort of like capturing sound in these places, like my heart feels so soft. And I guess the question I have for you is like, I think that kind of longing and dreaming into the future requires a genuine vulnerability. What are your personal practices of sort of like stamina and building and fortifying to allow you to then be so soft-hearted and open up in that way?
I mean, I guess for me, like I have quite a privileged place in the movement of going around and seeing so many different project. So when I go to places to speak, I go, whether I'm going to see transition groups here or whether I'm in France or wherever it is, I get to go and see. So a lot of the ideas for these pieces of music came from places that I was visiting. One of the tracks is about a restaurant in Marseille called Le Pressage, which is the first 100% solar restaurant. They cook with these big mirrored dishes out the back that focus the Marseille sun into the back of the stove, and they cook using the sun. And actually, the very first track we made was made because I was in this restaurant and I happened to have my recorder with me, and I interviewed the guy who ran it, and we built the track out of that. Um, so I that stuff kind of feeds me really, and I try to keep a kind of a curiosity about exploring different things. You know, the artist Jean de Buffet once said, art never lies down in the bed that's made for it. Its best moments is when it forgets what it's called. And for me, that the bits of transition that excite me the most are the bits that aren't the bits that we thought of in the model, or the bits that it's when transition does things that nobody quite expects transition to do, are the bits that are the really, really fascinating and exciting bits. So so I'm just kind of endlessly curious about that. But I do think there is something also within your question, which is there is something about in the world today, and there are some questions here that I'm sure we'll get onto as well. You know, and there's Anaïg who was on this call, who made the film Return to Plabennec in France, who dressed up as a time traveler in her town and went around trying to inspire people to get involved in transition. You'll probably remember last year when there was the election in France, and the far right came very, very close. They won the first round of the voting. And then for the first time since the 1930s, the left finally managed to get its shit together and form some kind of a coalition that managed to hold them at bay. And Anaïg went to the march in Nantes of the Front Populaire, which was the left coalition, in her full time traveler costume with her "I've been to the future, we won" sign. There's a photograph that was taken of her in front of the Front Populaire sign with all the people behind, and with her "I've been to the future, we won" sign, which got in most of the French newspapers. It went mad on social media. It got on the telly. And when I talked to her and I said, why do you think that was? And she said, because I think in that moment, when the future looked really bleak, to have somebody kind of step through from there and go, actually, it's going to be all right. There's a real power to that. And it takes to hold the posture of that takes, I don't know what it takes really. There's a sort of a quality to, maybe there's a mixture of kind of compassion and theatricality and playfulness and willingness to sit with the ridiculous. There's a lovely quote in the book from Jim Data that said, any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. When I go around doing talks and workshops, I spend a lot of time just urging people to be more ridiculous and more comfortable in being ridiculous, because I feel like that's a really kind of untapped potential there.
And Rob, is there anything in your that you practice that helps you to avoid burning out in this work?
I have very good people who are around me and who don't tell me. The thing with this book is, like did I say at the beginning, you know, I always feel like maybe this is a book where all of you go, well, do you know what? I was with him up until the imagination book, but he's really lost it now. I have no idea what he's on about at all. And I guess to have people around who kind of will say, no, actually, this is kind of all right. You know, I've got my kids around, and I draw and I do printmaking, and I don't know, things like that really. I don't do this all the time. And actually writing a book is quite a nice sort of reflective process. It's what happens when the book comes out is where the burnout starts to loom, because you have to go off and do 10 million things. But actually I don't know. I'm endlessly curious about this stuff and very passionate about this stuff. And I think maybe that kind of propels it as well.
That's great. Sophie has a brilliant question about your time machine. Sophie, are you with us?
She wouldn't be the first now. She wouldn't be the first.
Sophie, are you still on the call? Would you like
I am still on the call. Yeah, I just wanted to know if your time machine went backwards as well as forwards, Rob. And if so, what can we learn from the past?
That's a very good question. Yes, well, when we did the podcast, we would often we would always take the guests in the podcast, and we would often start just with we would warm it up before by popping back. Actually, Roman Krznaric, I'm sure I said his name wrong. He's just written a book about what we can learn from the past and drawing from examples in the past. I would kind of defer to him in terms of. Oh, Anna Eeks put a link to her documentary, which I really recommend, particularly if you've got good French. But it's really beautiful. It's like a sort of modern day transition Joan of Arc. It's really fantastic. What was I talking about? So I got distracted by that. I can't remember now. What was I talking about, Chris? Sorry, my brain's gone.
Was it about learning from the past?
Oh,
Where the
yes,
time
yes.
machine can
So
go back?
Roman has written a book. Roman has written a book about learning from the past, and I would really point you to that. It's brilliant. It's like so many of the things and the challenges that we face, people have faced different versions of before. What can we learn from how they responded to that? Yeah, we have taken some journeys back into the past, but actually the thing that really fascinates me is 2030. And I know 2030 gets a little bit closer every year. That's kind of how linear time works. But actually, I keep, and I often go and do workshops for organizations who say, Rob, 2030 is very, very near. Couldn't we make it 2040? And I always have to say, look, I'm not talking about some perfect finished utopia. The reason why I like to focus on 2030 is that the Paris Agreement, which is still not perfect, not ambitious enough, but it's still what we've got as a kind of a global roadmap to how we might do this in time, says that by 2030, we need to have cut our emissions by 48%, those of us in the global north. If we think, oh, actually, well, but wouldn't it be easier if we just push that out to 2040? Then that makes the target of where we've got to get to by 2050 like 2080 or something. And it's just ridiculous. That we have to pass through that hoop in 2030 to have any chance of getting to where we need to get to. The fact that we're procrastinating and pushing it out is no reason why we should be changing that as a target. The book is not there to negotiate with physics. It's to say, actually, we need to keep alive the possibility that we could still do that, and what would that actually be like. So, as I said, there are many, many, many different 2030s, and a lot of them are horrible. But we use the time machine always to go to that 2030 because it's such a fascinating place. And when we do the time machine exercise with people and get them to close their eyes and do that, I always make the point afterwards, doing this should be a daily practice, like meditation, like yoga, like running, whatever, because the reality is that doing the opposite of that is a daily practice for all of us. We wake up every morning, we open our laptop, we turn on our phone, we turn on the radio, and all the messages are going, everyone's horrible. I wouldn't bother. You stay in bed if I was you, actually. Frankly, everything's going to shit. Elon Musk is going to eat the world. And that's that. And the future just disappears. The future is being colonized by those things. So to have a daily practice of coming back to connecting to the future feels really, really precious and important to me.
Thank you. So it's a great question here from Claudia Fernandez de Cordoba. Claudia, are you still here? Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, yes, I am. First, it's great to meet you, Rob. I've literally read all your work, so it's really a pleasure. One of the question I want to ask you is, what do you see as the main insights from the book that are transferable to academia and research? Because I think there's a growing need from researchers to facilitate and support future thinking and reimagination work in whether it's co-production exercises or workshops. And I know that you also have like an academic background and you've worked in activism. So do you have any recommendations for how to build bridges across these areas and any insights for other researchers that are trying to do that?
Oof. I mean, I think a lot of the tools and activities that are in the book will be really, really useful. When I go into universities and I do sessions with students and we do the time travel exercise with them, it's often something that touches them very deeply and can be quite a profound experience for them. And academia doesn't doesn't go there necessarily, you know. And yeah, I mean, I don't know is the honest answer, because I don't really work in academia anymore. And I know that a lot of the tools that were in From What Is to What If, people who worked in universities found them really, really helpful and useful. And you know, I mean, and I always make the point that I feel like going to university should feel like you're going to the future every time, every day. Like university campuses, like I went to the University of Liège in Belgium. They have the most incredible. The students have created food gardens around one whole side of that university. And one of the photographs I use in my talk is a photograph of the university buildings and all these food gardens and tunnels and food growing. And I say, you know, in 2030, actually, when students are trying to decide which university to go to, and they're checking the different tables for different things, the thing they check most is which university grows the most food on campus. Because by 2030, that's one of the key things that determines which place you decide to go to. I think as well, you know, there's a whole lot of examples of transition work being done in universities. There's a very good guide on the Transition Network's website about how to create a transition university that draws from the experience of lots of universities. But what a time traveling university would look like, I'm really curious about that. That would be amazing.
I like that. Thank you so much, Rob.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia and Rob. We have another question from another Claudia about how do we work together internationally, and thinking about people involved in transition, working in different countries in their own communities, but in their own countries. How can we collaborate more internationally to raise the profile of this work?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Rob. Yeah, so I live in Sweden, as you know, and we recently had the Swedish transition conference, which we have every year, and we were thinking that it would be really good to get more input from transition internationally, rather than just us working kind of in a bubble. And we think it would be really useful to get more input from transition from different countries, and we're wondering how we can like have some kind of transition conference internationally around Europe. I don't know, different countries or different parts of Europe or something like that. So it's not just UK based all the time, but it's kind of, you know, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the honest answer to that is I don't know, because I'm not that involved on a day-to-day basis with Transition Network, and I know that within Transition Network, the relationship between the different national hubs, you know, there's a number of national hubs, and they have a network that they use to work together, and I'm a bit out of that loop, so I wouldn't like to comment on that really, but I know that you could, if you contact Transition Network, there's somebody there who coordinates the hubs, and they would be able to give you more up to date. My information on that is a few years out of date, so
There's
I would.
also, sorry, a fantastic response to that in the chat from Debs.
Oh, thanks, Debs. I didn't know Debs was here.
An online transition platform, which is a great place to connect and collaborate. And maybe someone will be able to put the link into the chat while we're speaking.
We've just been talking about that. But for example, Rob, when you're traveling around Europe and you're in Denmark, for example, it would be really useful. I think that we need to coordinate as transition hubs in the same part of Europe, so that to get you to come over the border into Sweden, it would only take you 20 minutes on a train, and it would have meant so much for us, and it probably wouldn't have taken up too much of your time. So little things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to know how to do that really, because actually I'm coming again in May, so we should have a chat.
Brilliant.
Because we could maybe do something in May, because I'm coming to Copenhagen to do something there, so we can pick that up afterwards.
Thanks, Rob.
Pleasure.
Super. So we've had a few quick fire questions, which I'm just going to ask you, Rob, just given the time. Severine is asking, when is your next workshop?
Oh yes. Oh, my next workshop is so I do them when so I was in Portugal in November, and I did tons of them all over the place. But I'm doing one in the main one I'm doing in the UK is going to be at Hawkwood House. It's going to be the last weekend of May, whatever that is, the 27th, 28th. Oh, no, maybe I don't know. Anyway, it's the last weekend of May. It's on the Hawkwood House website. It's Friday evening, Saturday, Sunday, and it'll be kind of a deep dive into the book, which will have just come out by then. And I'll be sharing all the tools and activities and exercises that I use. And Hawkwood House is a gorgeous place. And if you fancy coming to that, we'll have a lot of fun.
Well, there's a new, I don't know if you can hear me well because it's pretty noisy here, but there's a new theater in Paris, which is called Théâtre de la Concorde, which is dedicated to democracy and transition and citizenship. And we're having our first festival exactly at those dates. And that's going to be about using art to raise awareness on environmental issues and climate change.
Amazing.
That's exactly the same dates.
Okay, that's a shame.
We'll find a way,
Fabulous.
but in everything that you were saying, like all those imaginary and sensory exercises that you mentioned, this is exactly what we do as actors to go into the skin of a character, and that's what I'm trying to do and to bring to the theater crowd as well. So yeah, I'd love to do a workshop with you.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I keep an eye. I'm sure I'll be doing some in France at some point, and you'll see them on my various social things.
Thank you.
Super. So Margot would like to know, will you be at the Hay Festival this year?
I hope so. I don't know yet. We have sent, I think the publisher has sent the manuscript to the Hay Festival, and we'll see. I hope so, because I love speaking at the Hay Festival, and what I'd love would be to do field recordings from the future at the Hay Festival, but I don't know if the timings are a bit too tight for that. But that would be a magical thing to bring there, I think. But yes, hopefully.
Fantastic. And Ben would like to know, who are your favorite musicians to listen to while writing?
There's a Norwegian ambient music artist called Biosphere, who has made all sorts of incredible records. He made an album called Substrata, which is absolutely beautiful. And there's also a website called astrangelyisolated.place.com, which is where they release music, but they also have lots of different mixes of ambient electronic music by different artists there. And there's more than 100 really amazing mixes by different people, which is a good place to start, maybe. And Boards of Canada, who Rich very kindly played at the beginning, who are fantastic.
That's great. So people will get into that music, and we'll have lots more inspiring books coming forth while we're all writing.
Absolutely.
There's a couple of people in the chat have been asking about this longing for the future, but how we need to rethink a lot about the way that we're living right now in terms of the global economy, in terms of the pace of life, and needing to embrace a slower, simpler life. Can you say something about how the kind of work that you're doing and the exercises that you're inviting people to do can help to also kind of shift what we're longing for?
Yeah. And I mean, and also reading the questions, there's also an element of that, which is, how on earth can Rob be possibly finding anything to be optimistic about whatsoever, given the science and given where we're at, which is a very valid response. And which is why I think the focus of what I am doing is on a 2030 that's not perfect. It's not a utopia, but it is what we could still do if we did everything we could possibly do. So there are some people who will say, but Rob, everything is irretrievably broken, and climate change is now completely locked in, and collapse is inevitable within 10 years. Okay, you may well be right. I'm probably not doing this project. This probably isn't going to appeal to you, but for me, there is the reality for me, through the way that I read the science, is that climate change is not something you win or lose. Every fraction of a degree is absolutely vital and affects the lives of millions and millions of people. So finding the way to slow that and to keep that as low as we can feels like the thing to do to me. And either we can do that by telling people all the things that they should be running, screaming in the opposite direction from, or maybe we can do it by giving people something to run towards helping people to have a kind of a new North Star. I'm not naive to say climate change is going to magically disappear. I'm not naive to saying somehow this within our lifetimes is going to magically disappear. We are in a warming world. We are in a world where the climate is changing. The point is that we need to keep that as low as possible, and that maybe just thinking that we're going to do that by talking about collapse and extinction has clearly not worked, and that maybe we need another approach, which is about what we could still create. So, in the book, I talked to Peter Kalmus, who's a climate scientist. And I remember we had this long conversation where I said, okay, you write endless reports and you go on the TV and you talk about what's the worst case scenario, what's going to happen. But you don't very often talk about the best case scenario. What is the most that we could pull out of this if we did absolutely everything? And he talked about it. He said our economy would need to go into emergency mode. And he talked about that. And so, but for me, I thought, well, okay, that's great, but it's not a very catchy, it's not a very, maybe we need to find a different way of talking about what that is. It's like delicious transition mode, or a different way of talking about how we do that. But then at one point I said to him, I was kind of nervous. I was thinking, is he going to say, actually, the very idea that we even talk about pulling something meaningful out of this is just naive, hopium nonsense. And I said, I'm writing a book called How to Fall in Love with the Future. Do you think there's a value to that? And he said, and I won't use the word, but he said, I think it's effing awesome. And it was like, okay, that's fantastic. To get that kind of sign off from somebody saying, no, actually there is, thinking we have to uncancel the future. We have to, for me, finding things to be hopeful about and finding things that we can move towards is a radical act at this time, when all the far right leaders around the world are saying the future's terrible, it's going to be horrible, it's going to be horrible. If we keep feeding that narrative, we just keep accelerating that narrative. And the reality is that when we talk about the future that we could still create, I'm not like plucking some fantastical utopias out of the sky. That's kind of part of the point of why the book has field recordings from the future accompanying it, which is the future that I'm talking about is basically the super blocks of Barcelona, the food system of Liège, the car-free neighborhoods of the Vauban and Freiburg, the cycling networks of Utrecht. All this stuff already exists somewhere. There's a whole chapter in the book that says this already works here. Don't tell me this stuff's impossible, because I've been to Montsartou in the south of France, where the school meals are 100% organic and 80% of them are grown in the town at the same price that the French governments give us the budget for every other place in France to procure their school meals. Don't tell me that's impossible, because I've been there. And also it has a huge knock-on benefit for people in that town. Then now the population of the wider town eat 25% less meat, 28% less ultra-processed food than they did before the council brought that approach in. All those different things that we need to do already exist somewhere. This is not impossible. And so I guess that's what I'm trying to kind of pull together with that. Then that allows us to start to change the direction by giving us something to move towards. But it's not assuming that climate change magically disappears, but we need to find the more skillful ways to slow that, and then hopefully over time start to reverse it.
So we're coming towards the end of our time together. Just as a closing thought, Rob, I would like to ask you a question that's maybe come up a little bit in the chat, but you spoke there about some of the narrative and the way that a lot of people are feeling about the future, being very anxious, feeling despondent. Could you leave us, the people on this call who are maybe engaged and doing some of this work already, could you leave us with some advice about how we can help other people to fall in love with the future too, and invite them into this work? Play Cupid, if you like.
Well, just one thing I wanted to mention just before I do that, which is that one of the other things that I forgot to mention that is also running in parallel, which will be coming out the following year, is my friend Thomas, who is on the call here in Belgium. Thomas Liera, who is an amazing cartoonist. He and I are working on a comic book about Mr. Kit and myself traveling to 2030 and visiting all of these extraordinary places. And it's going to be really beautiful and magical. And my hope is that maybe the Christmas after that comes out, actually all what kids want is a little sustainably produced, ethically created little time traveler doll, because that becomes the story about we want to travel to that world. And so yeah, we're working on that comic book now, and it's very good fun as well.
Rob, before you go on, I'm going to make an intervention. Hi folks. Thomas would love to share his sketch.
Oh, Thomas, share your sketch.
Trying to connect, going, hey Thomas, I haven't met Thomas before. Who are you? What's the sketch? I had no idea. Thomas, you have co-host rights. You'd be able to share screen, I think, my friend. And great to see you here. Great to meet you.
Thomas is the most phenomenal cartoonist, and
hello everybody.
I like to work with him.
Ciao. Okay. I'm just sharing my screen. It's okay because I've done a sketch during the talk, and yes, it's a crazy man on a bicycle coming from the past. Wait. Sharing. Voila. Do you see my screen? Voila. That's the sketch that I've done during the talk. Yes, it's maybe you know this guy. And this is Mr. Kit. He's a friend of Rob. He's a musician, and they are coming from a portal. And but my favorite character is not this. It's this guy. So voila. I'm just sharing this because it was funny to have a bicycle with compost power and seaweed, of course. So thank you so much. Grazie.
You're amazing. You're amazing.
That is beautiful. Thank you, Thomas, for sharing that.
He draws the best beavers. It's just perfect. Yeah. So I did a talk in a little town called Gerpine in Belgium, and Thomas was sitting in the front row with a big sketchbook, and it looked like he was taking loads and loads of notes. I thought, oh, that guy's really interested. And we got to the end of the talk, and then it came up, and he'd done this beautiful portrait of me while I was speaking, and he said, we need to do a project together. And so this is that project. Oh, there he is. Look, that's his picture that he did of me there. Yes, beautiful. I'm not sure about the ears, but there we go. So to answer your question, well, I hope that that the book will give you some tools with that. I think maybe there is something about flipping the narrative and the way that we talk about these things. So rather than talking about everything that's going wrong, that maybe there is also, which we need to do as well, right? I'm not saying we need to airbrush all of that out of what we're doing, but it does strike me that there's also something about sharing with people the world that we long for. Explicitly talking about that. I'd love to live in there. I'd love the rivers in this city to be so clean that I could swim to work. Oh, that opens up some really interesting conversations. It's why I love the prison abolition movement in the United States so much, and they reappear quite a lot through the book, because that question of what if there were no prisons, then people go, yeah, but if there were no prisons, we'd have to have a really different kind of education system. Yeah, keep going. It's like, actually, when we can open up those really good what if questions that can unlock longing. One of the activities as well that I do when I do workshops is something, there was our friend who was on this call in Paris, Séverine, who was talking about being an actor. When I was researching the last book, I went to do an improv training, a weekend improv training, which is such fun. And one of the things you learn on that, which I now do in all my talks, is the difference between yes, but and yes, and building that kind of culture, giving people that experience of yes, and doing yes, but yes, and with 1,000 people in a hall is such a blast. And you do the first, people take it in turns making suggestions for a picnic that they're going to take in the future. And in the first round, you have to respond to the other person just by being as negative as you can possibly be. In the second round, you respond by kind of accepting their invitation, but just with no enthusiasm at all. And in the last round, you do the yes and it's so amazing to see this room just fills up with laughter and bright eyes and connection, and it's fantastic. So I think giving people, sharing our longing with people, and giving people an experience of yes and, bringing yes and into those conversations. That when I went to Luxembourg a few years ago, I was interviewed on Luxembourgish TV by the leading political journalist, a woman who always wears a green suit on Luxembourgish television. And she interviewed me for about an hour. And every question that she asked me started with her saying, yes, but. So I'd go, she'd say, what about the transition movement, Rob? And I go, da 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 da. And she'd go, yes, but, and pull it all back down again. And then I'd have to start again, da 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 da, yes, da, da, yes, but. And by the end, after 45 minutes of this, I was exhausted. And I was thinking, in my head, I was thinking, am I going to point this out to her? And so when it came to the last question, I said, I just wanted to point out that every question you've asked me, it started with the words, yes, but, and how different this conversation would have been if it had started with yes, and. So I think if we can bring some more yes, and into how we work with people and in our groups, that's a very powerful thing too.